Welcome back, everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment, and we're continuing our coverage Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, focused very heavily, at least for now, on this new coronavirus, but going broader now into a few other topics. We're going to be starting today with Hong Kong, where the Chinese Communist Party recently proposed new national security laws, and the protests have started again. There are also complaints filed against the Biden Center for undisclosed and very large donations from China. We're also going to be going into how the Chinese regime is being accused of rigging the elections in South Korea. And also, folks, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, we really need your support helping grow this channel. Now, that said, let's jump into it. So first off, the fight for Hong Kong freedom. Now, just as a bit of background on this, the Chinese Communist Party is holding its largest annual conference right now, where all the top Chinese leadership is there. You might remember in our previous episode we noted that a strange phenomena took place when they first began, which is in Beijing at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, the sky turned pitch black. It was such a bizarre phenomena that many Chinese netizens posted about it online. Many people said they've never seen anything like it, including very elderly people who've lived in Beijing all their lives. Now, that said, among the proposals they're already pushing is a set of new security laws for Hong Kong. It's pretty vague what these actually mean.
Provide for, and this is a very general word, to provide for a mechanism in Hong Kong to enforce the law.
Now, it's not clear exactly what these new security laws will entail, but in Hong Kong they're interpreting this as the Chinese Communist Party coming out into the open and saying they're getting rid of this system that they had agreed to originally, of one country, two systems, where Hong Kong is a free and democratic society that is outside of the reach of Chinese Communist Party law. If the Chinese Communist Party creates new national security laws or security laws that can restrict things in Hong Kong, this is a clear violation of that. Now, on that note, it's unclear where this is going to go because U.S. lawmakers are standing by Hong Kong. They're proposing new sanctions on Chinese officials if the Chinese regime moves through with this. But to the news for now. Tear gas has been fired, arrests have been made as thousands of people protest against the Chinese regime's planned national security laws in Hong Kong. Now, the Hong Kong protests had evolved over time. They again started with this extradition treaty, but over time they turned into protests against the Chinese Communist Party's influence in Hong Kong overall. And these new proposed laws from the Chinese Communist Party are a more clear example that is exactly what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. And so it's likely from here we will see a return of these large-scale protests. And already Hong Kong police are being accused of abusing their power. We have a video here of water cannons being deployed against journalists in Hong Kong. Normally journalists are out of bounds when it comes to these measures. There have been several other videos of what's happening on the ground. We'll show you one right now. Hong Kong police have allegedly been stealing from stores. And also Jimmy Lai, the head of Apple Daily, one of the larger independent Hong Kong news outlets, came out on Twitter calling for the support of the United States. He notes that they have kicked off a new campaign, and he's calling on Hong Kongers, Americans, and global citizens to please write to Donald Trump to appeal for his support to our quest for freedom and democracy. Now, the United States is already taking a stand against the abuses of the Chinese Communist Party. Just recently, they slapped sanctions on 33 Chinese companies and institutions. South China Morning Post reports, quote, 24 companies and institutions, including the tech giant Qihao 360 Technology, were placed on the first so-called entity list for, quote, supporting procurement of items for military end use in China. And it notes that 9 of these entities were put on a second list for their alleged roles in rights violations in the Xinjiang region. Now, what they mean by rights violations in the Xinjiang region is the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of the Muslim minority group known as Uyghurs in that area. The Chinese Communist Party has brutally persecuted Muslim Uyghurs, including putting them in slave camps and using them for slave labor. Other groups they persecute very heavily Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, and house Christians. And while the United States is moving to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable, the Chinese Communist Party is coming out and playing the victim. They're saying now that the United States is pushing the conflict to the brink of a, quote, Cold War. And the Trump administration does not seem to be interested in shying away from such accusations. Here we have a story from MSN saying the Trump administration is discussing conducting its first U.S. nuclear tests in decades. And while all this is happening, the Taipei Times is reporting that the Chinese regime may utilize this current situation of unemployment to bolster its military. Here it has a story, virus outbreak, China unemployment might aid PLA, the People's Liberation Army. It says, quote, nearly 9 million students are to graduate from university next month, and Beijing plans to use incentives to convince them to join the military, an analyst said. The Chinese Communist Party's military notably is different from that of other countries, especially from the United States. In the U.S. military is sworn to protect the Constitution. In China, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is basically the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a party military, not a national military. And issues of Chinese Communist Party influence are being uprooted right now in the United States. And just recently, it seems the Biden Center is getting caught up in some of this controversy. First up, we have the National Legal and Policy Center, which just filed a complaint against the University of Pennsylvania and the Biden Center for Undisclosed, what they call Chinese mega donations. Since 2017 alone, when the Biden Center opened and after Joe Biden announced he was running for president in April 2018, the university received over $70 million from China, of which $22 million were listed as anonymous. And it continues, federal law requires the disclosure of the source of all donations over $250,000. Now, just being clear on this, it's not clear whether Biden was directly involved in this, and the issue of universities accepting large donations from China, including undisclosed donations, is one of the major topics in the U.S. right now. And on that note, here we have a story from Town Hall saying, quote, Education Department uncovers billions in unreported foreign donations from China and Russia to U.S. colleges. The Department of Education told House Republicans during a briefing and in a letter their investigation into institutions of higher education for foreign investment and donations has so far uncovered over $6 billion of previously unreported foreign donations from known adversarial countries. And of course, I've reported on this pretty heavily in the past. The Chinese Communist Party is pretty open about this. They have several different programs targeted at academics. There's the Torch program, there's the 9/11 program, there's the 273 program, there's the 1,000 Talents program, the list goes on. The Chinese regime has two main projects directing economic theft, China 2025 and Project 863. They've been very, very aggressive on these things, and they've been doing these things for decades. It's good now, at least in my opinion, that the United States is finally working to clear these things out. Now, notably, I've been working as an investigative reporter on this topic, focused on it since 2008. A lot of my work originally was focused on uncovering the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Work Department, which is one of their main government branches focused on subverting overseas communities. And notably as well, it's also tied to the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, which are directed and financed a lot of times directly by the Chinese consulates. And these are the organizations that use Chinese students to, say, launch protests against things that go against the interest of the Chinese Communist Party. They'll also keep tabs on visiting Chinese students. So, for example, if a Chinese student comes to the United States to study, and say, for example, while they're here they join a democracy protest or an event supporting human rights in Tibet, this group, the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, will very often report them. And you've had cases of this in Canada. You've had open cases of this in Australia. It's very common to happen. These operate openly in the United States. Not to mention things like the Confucius Institutes, organizations financed by the Chinese Communist Party, going into universities, oftentimes paying the universities money to host their language and culture programs. And notably, the culture they're promoting and the narratives they're promoting are those of the Chinese Communist Party, not of traditional Chinese culture. So again, this is a very, very large-scale issue that the Chinese regime has not been very secretive about. They've been pretty open about what they do, how they do it, including even their projects and the names of their projects and descriptions of their projects. For example, my own research working on this in the past, I'd interview individuals and meet individuals who were part of these things, and they'd hand over their business card, and they'd have like 11 titles on their business card sometimes, and they'd have 3 names of Chinese espionage departments listed. They don't try to hide it. And so if the U.S. wants to go after these networks, the number of individuals that they could really press charges against could be massive. And on that note here, we have a story from Boston Magazine saying, as the FBI continues hauling university scholars and researchers off in handcuffs for their work with the Chinese, academics all over Boston are asking, am I next? And while they'd only be asking, am I next, if they were directly involved with the Chinese Communist Party and were taking undisclosed gifts from the Chinese regime, which is what a lot of these individuals are being charged for right now. And on the note of the Chinese regime exerting influence over foreign communities, in South Korea right now there is concern that the Chinese Communist Party may have influenced the outcome of their elections. Now there's a few different stories on this. Here we'll start with a tweet which has some documents attached to it. It says, quote, a programmer left an Easter egg, quote, follow the party, in the software inside the vote counting machine used in South Korea's election in 2020. What's a Chinese Communist Party slogan doing inside a South Korean ballot counting machine? And some other information may explain that. Here we have the IBI Times. It says, were the April parliamentary elections in South Korea rigged and fraudulent? The April parliamentary elections in South Korea were a resounding triumph for the ruling Democratic Party, or DPK, of President Moon Jae-in. However, accusations and suspicions have since emerged that the victory may have been tainted by fraud and vote rigging. And here's the main claim in that. East Asia Research reported that the wrongdoing in the election likely involved digital fraud, i.e. the manipulation of vote counting machines, computer hardware and software, and information network telecom equipment apparently manufactured by controversial Chinese tech giant Huawei. Huawei has been one of the major focuses of concern in the United States for things like espionage, spying, and overall Chinese electronics are known to have built-in backdoors, built-in issues. Part of the Chinese Communist Party's national security law requires such thing. It says that all data needs to be viewable and controllable. So in other words, there's no such thing as a device that is collecting information in any part of the world that the Chinese Communist Party is not able to access. If the product is being manufactured in China, it is beholden to China's laws, and that is one of its laws. Now, it's unclear whether this Huawei equipment actually altered the outcome of this election. This article also notes, quote, the fraud also likely involved quick response, or QR codes, that were only present in the mail-in votes and in early ballots, not on election day itself. And Gordon Cheng, a leading China expert, wrote on Twitter, quote, the great Dr. Taro, referring to the apparent irregularities in South Korea's April 15 National Assembly elections, told me this today, quote, Moon Jae-in's government is afraid this will end up in the international spotlight. Now, just to be clear, this has not been fully investigated yet. It is a suspicion in South Korea right now based on this strange note that was left on the election equipment and based on suspicions around Huawei and its involvement in these machines where that strange note was found. It's also not clear whether the South Korean government was in any way involved in this or if they knew about it at all. That said, the Chinese Communist Party has an entire military branch focused on political warfare. It's called the Liaison Department, and it's under the General Political Department. There's a think tank, Project 2049 Institute, that had a whole report just on this department. And, we've all heard by now this, talk about Russia trying to rig U.S. elections and, warnings about Russia. A lot of the information that came out on that, it's unclear whether anything actually did happen. It seems that there is bigger crimes involved in that, which in future episodes we'll be going into. But the Chinese Communist Party Despite all this talk about Russia, the Chinese Communist Party has an entire military branch dedicated to operations like that, to influence the politics of other countries. Now that said, folks, it's Monday, so we'll be going over a few questions and comments from viewers. First up, we have Lana Brown. She says, quote, Josh, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for everything you do. However, please change your fire alarm batteries before you share. It was very distracting. A few of you mentioned that. I really apologize. I'm in an apartment. It's actually not in my apartment you're hearing. It's from the hallway or one of the neighbors. I did talk to our superintendent and he agreed to change the battery. I actually volunteered to go do it myself and I did. Turns out that I still hear it beeping. It might have been before actually 2 separate fire alarms beeping. Really apologize. It's one of the downsides of having to work from home. It's nice in its own regard, don't get me wrong. I enjoy it to a pretty good degree, but you get things like this. That said, I will be back in the office recording again starting next week. And don't worry, I'll be keeping the same format, same kind of analysis-based pseudo-discussion format, so don't worry about that changing. And also, yeah, working from home has its difficulties. I do a lot of radio interviews, a lot of some TV interviews. I've had, for example, ice cream men, outside on the street pull up and play their music loudly when I'm in the middle of like a really serious tangent. Anyways, moving on. Jay Sunny said, quote, what would it take for Epoch Times to have a seat at the White House press conference? Actually, Epoch Times is White House approved. We do have journalists at these White House briefings. But currently, we are not there because they have these new social distancing laws in place. And when it comes to these briefings, here's something a lot of people don't know. Say the press pool, the individuals allowed in these briefings, are not being selected by the Trump administration. They're not being selected by the U.S. government. The press pool is controlled by this press association in Washington. And so pretty much a lot of the organizations involved in it are the ones who select who gets in and who's not allowed in. And so, unfortunately, we would love to be there. We're not currently allowed in because of the social distancing rules. And even when you are allowed in, because the press pool runs the whole thing, all the seating is assigned. Oftentimes, just a handful of media get called on. It's changing a bit, but that's typically how it usually is. And that brings up some important questions that Trump has himself raised, which is there have, of course, been several different news outlets that are tied to the Chinese Communist Party that have been allowed in, such as Phoenix TV. And so why are these directly or heavily controlled news outlets by the Chinese Communist Party being allowed in when pretty big independent media are not being allowed in? It's a question that needs to be answered, in my opinion. Now, a few of you mentioned, so in a previous episode we noted the Epoch Times did an investigation into YouTube censorship, and we reported that they were censoring certain Chinese words. Several of you posted the English translation of those Chinese words into the comment section, and of course they were not censored. I should be clear, the terms that they're censoring are not the English terms, they're the Chinese terms. And so you have to actually use the Chinese characters for it. Now, a couple of those terms notably are Chinese bandit, which is not a discriminatory term. It's actually a Chinese term, and it has a long history to it. And also 50 Cent, referring to the Chinese Communist Party's 50 Cent army of paid internet trolls. So actually, our team at Crossroads, we just tested these terms again to make sure they're still being censored, and yes, they are still being censored. If you folks want to try it yourself, we'll see if they're still doing it when this publishes. We can't post it in the comments, obviously. We can't post it in the description because they'll probably pull down the video. But in the description, we have a link to a Google Doc where in each video we're going to be posting our different sources used in each episode. You can go in there and we'll put the Chinese characters in there. You can copy and paste them, try it yourself. And now, again, folks, just as a last note, really, I read the comments you all leave. I don't get a chance, again, to thank all of you. You're all very kind. Mostly. Even those who aren't, it's fine. I don't mind being criticized. In fact, I appreciate it. If you see something I do wrong, tell me about it. If you think I make an error, tell me about it. If I make an error, I'll correct it. Also, many of you have donated to this channel. We do take donations. And I mean, really, some of you have been incredibly generous. I can't thank you enough. I mean, our team, we can't thank you enough. It's really because of you that we're able to make this show happen. Now, with that said, folks, again, we're going to be doing these broadcasts Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. And yes, when I go back to the office next week, it'll still be 5 days a week, same time, same place. Don't worry about it. If you want to watch our premieres on YouTube, you can join the live discussions. That is 10:30 Eastern Time. Again, Monday through Friday. And that said, folks, again, please take care of yourselves. Stay healthy. We'll see you next time.